Alright guys, today's video we're going to be going over part 2 of behind the scenes of my short film Angel 1. If you haven't seen part 1 already or the short film, links to those videos are in the description down below. In this video we're going to be covering the set design, the lighting, props and costumes that were used, as well as what went into casting the characters. Well, let's get started. Alright, set design. So when I started this project, I wanted to make a film entirely shot in my basement apartment. When I thought about building the set for Angel 1, it had to be cheap, inexpensive. So I set out to build a spaceship using only free materials. I had some sheets of plywood at home already from an old desk. I got some more wood from a friend, and I found some other wood on the side of the road. So the main structure of the spaceship cockpit is actually made out of wood, which costs altogether $0. I used duct tape to tape the seams so that light wouldn't spill into the cockpit. Due to the lack of wood, it was a little sketchy the way it was made. I had to put little pieces of wood to support it from tipping. On one side, the panel's actually on hinges, allowing me to open and getting in there with a camera for different shots. Once the structure was made, I painted it with a gray high gloss paint, trying to make it give a little more of a shine. I wanted it to give it more of a metallic look without paying for metallic paint. Once everything was painted gray, I had to make it look more like a spaceship. To do that, I literally took tinfoil baking trays and painted them black. I took pop cans, painted those black, and even used the plastic trays that mushrooms come in and painted those black. These recyclables, when painted black, began to look more like panels on the back of the ship. I didn't want it to look like random panels on a piece of wood, so I needed to add more texture. I used random electronics that I had laying around the house, took them apart, and hot glued the components all over the spaceship. I had a couple broken PC controllers that I took apart, and I used them as buttons for throughout the spaceship. For the chair, I actually used the chair I'm sitting on now. It's just a regular computer chair. To make it look a little bit more spacey, I took an old monitor stand, put it upside down, and zip tied it to the headrest. That put spikes on the back, which I thought made it look a little bit more like a spaceship chair. Another way for me to get the texture that I wanted, I added wires throughout the spaceship. Some were hanging, some were glued, some were screwed. The wires that I used the most are actually Ethernet cables. If you take one Ethernet cable and strip the coating off the outside, you end up with multiple strands of wire. They're different colors, and this adds a little bit more texture and dynamic to the set design. For the controls of the spaceship, I used a joystick that I had from when I was, 12. And the throttle is actually an industrial light fixture that was broken that I found, which I had added padding to the bar to make it look more like a handle. And the screen that's in front of the pilot that shows their HUD is actually the glass from that light fixture, which I attached to a tripod using a clamp. In the end, except for the paint, everything was found, or I already had, or I got from friends. Alright, lighting. I didn't own any professional lights at the time of shooting Angel 1, so I set out to light the entire thing with practical lights. This meant lighting the scene with lights that are actually in the scene instead of lights behind the camera shining in. I bought an RGB LED light strip off Amazon. This allowed me to change the colors in the scene depending on what was happening. I didn't want it to look like strips, so I found this transparent tube in a garbage can, cut it in half, and I actually lined the inside with wax paper to give it more of a cloudy look so it wasn't as transparent. When I put the strips through, the whole tube lights up, but you don't necessarily see each individual LED diode. I also used a daylight LED light strip. This one I found in a box next to a dumpster, oddly enough. That LED strip I actually embedded in the wood rails on either side of the ship. I put them on an angle so that they would cast light on the sides of the ship. With the two light strips, the majority of the scene was lit. To light the back of the actors, I actually used two dollar store lights. They had a bit of a panel look to it, and I just stuck them on both sides. This brought more light to the cockpit, but also brought way more light onto the side and behind the actors. The rest of the lights that were used were really small practicals, most of which came from a secondhand store. For a couple dollars, I bought a bag of lights that you put into pumpkins after you've carved them out at Halloween. These lights flickered or pulsed or changed colors, and I thought that would add a little bit more movement to the cockpit. After that, I needed to light the actor's face. Because they had a helmet on with a plastic visor, I couldn't really necessarily shine a light on them as it would reflect and give me all kinds of reflections that I didn't want. So instead, I needed to light the actor's face from within the helmet. I found this LED light switch at the dollar store for a few bucks. I took it apart and rewired the LED bars inside the helmet. These LEDs were a little too bright after I added a power supply to them, so I actually diffused them by taping parchment paper over them, as I didn't have any proper diffusion paper. I also used a couple newer LED lights just to fill the cockpit with a little bit more light so I didn't have to crank up the ISO when filming. And those are all the lights that went into lighting up the cockpit and the actors. As far as the lighting effects go, while spaceships fly by, during explosions, I used a number of different lights for those. One of these lights I had is this antique light bar that you actually have to put light bulbs in. I had found a bunch of these yellow LED bulbs that I had put in the bar, and when the spaceship flies by really fast, it's actually us taking this bar and whipping it really fast around the room to create this illusion that something has flown by. At the very end, when Angel 1 is flying his spaceship into the enemy cruiser and it's getting brighter and brighter and brighter, we actually used a Godox light with a softbox and we just pushed it right into him to the point where it was basically right next to his face off camera to really overexpose the shot. For all the shots where they're getting bombarded by the enemy's cannons or when they're shooting their own machine guns, those lighting effects were all done by the roto lights. I borrowed 3 from a friend of mine and I had 2 guys pushing buttons randomly to make it seem like they were getting hit from all over the place. For when they shoot and they pull the trigger, I wanted more of a warm color, so we put a filter on, and we actually used, I think, a lightning effect on that one to give it more of a pulsating, bursting effect. Alright, props and costumes. The main part of the costume was definitely the helmet. I found a face shield on Amazon, and it was by far the most expensive thing bought for this film. The face shield didn't have a backing for the helmet, so I used a sheet of EVA foam that I already had to close off the back of the helmet. I've never made anything out of EVA foam before, and so my cuts were not clean, and it was quite rough. In the light, you can see how terrible it actually really looks. But I knew that once it was in a dimly lit cockpit, that I could definitely get away with it. I added wires and knobs to give it more of a space-like look, and used the LEDs from that light switch as I mentioned before. I spaced them out, glued them in, and wired them together using a couple strands of Ethernet cable. I brought the wire to the back of the helmet, where I spliced on an old USB cord. I then plugged the USB into a USB power adapter, so that I was able to plug it into the wall so there was no need to use batteries. The reason why I had done that is because originally I had a battery pack, and during some test shots the batteries were draining so fast that the first shot my face was super lit and by the end my face was super dim. As far as the rest of the costume goes, it was just black pants. I had a long sleeve black shirt that had a cool texture to it, which I used just in case if there was any close-ups that you could see the shirt, it wouldn't look as flat as a regular shirt. For the seat belt, I actually just used some old military straps that I had meant for attaching to a belt. The actors just had them loosely over their shoulders, but it helped look like they were strapped in. I also wanted something on their chest similar to what you see on sci-fi pilots. I do a lot of backpacking, hiking, and I actually bought a chest rig a while back for winter camping. It was a perfect size to add a little bit more detail to the front of the actors. The costumes were super basic, but because I knew it was going to be dimly lit, I knew I could get away with it not looking necessarily as professional as a pilot. Alright, casting. As far as casting goes, I just needed to find 2 actors. The actor who played Angel 1 is a friend of mine who is actually into acting and is already doing acting work as an extra. The actor who played Angel 3 is another friend of mine. I don't know if he's ever acted before, but he definitely had the confidence to go for it. In the end, I think both of them played the parts quite well. Because they were both friends and they were both up for it, it cost me $0 for actors, which is ideal for low budget filmmaking. When it came to casting the voice of the computer, I wanted the voice to have an accent. Talking with my brother-in-law who lives in England, he mentioned a friend of his who he thought would do great at it. I figured I'd give it a go and see what her voice would sound like. He recorded it in England, emailed it over to me, and I added some effects to make it sound a little bit more robotic. In the end, I think it turned out amazing and couldn't have wished for a better result. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. If you don't want to miss any future content, be sure to subscribe. Until next time, adios.